And let's move on to the agenda item itself. So this is for possible action. Resolution number 1221, City of Boulder City. It's a public hearing and a recommendation to the City Council on a proposed amendment to Title 11 of the City Code to repeal Chapter 27, Historic Resources, and replace with a new Chapter 27, Historic Preservation. And Michael, would you please give the overview for the staff overview?
Good afternoon, Chairman Tuska, members of the Planning Commission, Michael Mays, your Community Development Director. So I have a short presentation I'd like to go through, highlighting the proposed ordinance. There are two areas that I want to cover in my presentation. First, a summary of how we got to this meeting tonight, and then to provide a brief overview of the proposed ordinance for your consideration. On the screen is the existing boundaries of the Historic Preservation Ordinance. I will talk in more detail about the existing ordinance and the regulations that are in place currently, and how this proposed modification would change those regulations. So, as part of the 2025 Boulder City Strategic Plan, one of the goals that was identified by the community and adopted by the City Council was to promote historic preservation efforts. Specifically, one of the action items contained within that goal was to evaluate the existing historic preservation ordinance and propose changes so that they are in line with the community's goals with respect to historic preservation. In October of 2020, the City Council approved Resolution 7167, which established the Boulder City Historic Preservation Ordinance Ad Hoc Committee that's been referenced earlier in the public comments. It represented 2 members of the Historic Preservation Committee and 2 members of the City Council. In January of 2021, the city contracted with Northwind Resources to update the surveys that had been conducted back in 1982 of every property within the historic district. That was the basis for the creation for the nomination to the National Register. There are approximately 517 properties, over 500. And with that 2021 survey update, Northwind had identified that only 43% of the properties contained within the historic district were still contributing to the district. And I'm going to explain that in more detail, what that means, a little later in the presentation. That is compared to the original survey in '82, where 82% of the properties were contributing to the district. The ad hoc committee held 6 meetings between 2020 and 2022. In June of 2021, the ad hoc committee held 2 workshops. They were identified and invited all the property owners within the historic district, one being focused on businesses within the historic district, the other on residential properties. And at those workshops, there was an opportunity to present the proposed draft ordinance and answer questions. In August of 2021, the City Council adopted Resolution 7323, which adopted the Boulder City Historic Preservation Plan. This was also one of the action items in the strategic plan, that the city should adopt a historic preservation plan. The recommendations within that plan included very specific recommendations on modifications to the Historic Preservation Ordinance, and the plan specifically referenced the SHPO Model Ordinance, which was the basis of the review of the ad hoc committee. In March of 2022, the ad hoc committee completed their work and provided a recommendation of a draft ordinance to the City Council. The ad hoc committee is suspended. Their role has been accomplished, and they have no further action. In May of 2022, City Council directed staff to begin the text amendment process. Anytime any proposed amendment to Title 11 of the City Code, which is also referred to as our zoning ordinance, is amended, it requires a public hearing before the Planning Commission and your review and recommendations onto the City Council. And that's the purpose for tonight's meeting. So I want to provide a summary of the proposed ordinance before you for your consideration. And before I talk about that, I want to talk about the existing ordinance. The existing ordinance, the most recent iteration was adopted in the mid-2000s, provides for the creation of historic districts. There are provisions in there already that address that. It requires a 45-day delay for any demolitions within the historic district. It requires Historic Preservation Committee review of certain improvements to properties within the historic district, and the recommendations by the committee are advisory. So, in terms of proposed changes to that ordinance, commission and or staff review would be determined based on whether the property is contributing or non-contributing to the historic district. Decision tree that's been provided in your packet is a proposed certificate of appropriateness approval matrix to address that. Now, it's important to point out that that is not codified with the ordinance before you, but what it is staff's proposed draft for consideration for the benefit of the Planning Commission to evaluate and certainly provide recommendations on, but it will require formal adoption by the City Council. And I'll describe it in greater detail in a second. With the proposed ordinance, decisions would be final by the proposed Historic Preservation Commission and or staff unless appealed to the City Council. So there's the option to appeal any decision made by either staff or the commission to the City Council. This is the draft matrix that staff has prepared. And what staff has done, we use as a model the example that was contained in the Historic Preservation Ordinance from another community, but try to tailor it to our community. So you can see the different types of actions in the left-hand column, anything from a proposed demolition to a modification to a structure within the historic district, and then a determination as to who would review that. You'll see that we have separated contributing and non-contributing properties, with a majority of the decisions regarding the proposed improvements being made for contributing properties by the Historic Preservation Commission and decisions on non-contributing properties by staff. What's also an important consideration here is that with these decisions, it's following the Secretary of Interior standards. It's also a recognition that non-contributing properties do not have the same weight in its contributing status to the historic district, and so the regulations concerning non-contributing should be much more flexible because it's the contributing properties that are still contributing to that historic district. And that would be reflected both in this proposed decision matrix and the design guidelines as modified for different historic structures, architectural standards of properties within the district. So, what is a contributing property? A contributing property is any structure that was built between 1930 and 1945. When the district was created, this was the period of significance, and that is what was established for the importance of the preservation of those structures and the creation of the district. Those properties today have not had very many modifications, and as a result still contribute to the architectural integrity of the properties built during that time period. So what are non-contributing properties? As you've already heard, a majority of the properties within the historic district are non-contributing. So any structure also built during that time period, 1930 to 1945, that has had so many modifications made to it that it no longer contributes to the district. Additions, roof modifications, those types of changes. It is no longer contributing to the district. A lot of examples of that are on the Avenue Streets. A lot of the properties on the Avenue Streets no longer contribute to the historic district. Any structure built after 1945, again, it was not built during the period of significance, so it can never contribute to the historic district. The only way that would be changed is if the community decided to create a new district or amended district for structures built during that time period. But they are non-contributing to the district. And certainly any new construction would not be contributing to the historic district. So modifications to the exterior of the building that can be seen from the public street would require review. So, and I'm going to reinforce this at the end of my presentation, but it's important to note that if an addition is done to the back of the property, cannot be seen from the public street, any interior modifications, they would not be regulated by this process at all. Because how the Secretary of Interior defines how a property contributes is from the public street. And the code before you also clarifies that does not include alleys. Because we've had questions, well, what about if I build a garage in my backyard and it can be seen by the alley? That would not be regulated by this, as long as it can't be seen from the front street. As I noted, interior improvements are not regulated by this. Ordinary maintenance, ordinary maintenance is not regulated by this. Any work that does not require a building permit would not be regulated by this. That's where their certificate of appropriateness that's defined within the ordinance is triggered, is through that building permit that comes before the city for review. And again, accessory buildings that cannot be seen from the street would not be regulated. With respect to contributing properties, demolition of the building, either full or impartial, would require review by the Historic Preservation Commission. Under the proposed draft ordinance, any decision by the commission, again, or staff, can be appealed to the City Council. So how would this impact non-contributing? Major modifications to the exterior of the buildings that can be seen from the street would require staff review. And again, it's the intent with the design guidelines that these would be much less restrictive, because the non-contributing properties no longer contribute to the district. What's contemplated with this is an example that if somebody wanted to put a significant addition, for example, like a second story to a non-contributing property, and all the other properties on that block are single story, that could potentially be regulated for non-contributing properties. But the more restrictive provisions that are contained within the code would not be. Demolition of buildings, full buildings, that are non-contributing would also be reviewed by the Historic Preservation Commission under this proposed ordinance. Demolition of partial for non-contributing would be reviewed by staff, and structures built after 1945 would also be reviewed by staff. Again, city staff is also very sensitive to the building permit process, and so the intent with this draft decision matrix is to ensure that whatever proposed ordinance is adopted does not add to the length and delay for the issuance of building permits. With all of these considerations, whether it's by staff or by the Historic Preservation Commission, it would be reviewed by the city's historic preservation consultant. So when I refer to staff review, I'm referring to Northwind Resources, which the city has a 5-year contract and has their expertise to be able to evaluate compliance with the Secretary of Interior standards. The considerations by the commission would also include the recommendation by the historic preservation consultant. Some of the other elements of the proposed ordinance. We've already talked about the decision matrix and either commission or staff approval. Provides for the creation of new historic districts. So like the existing ordinance in place, this provides for the potential creation of new districts throughout the community and includes steps on how that can be initiated. It also provides maintenance standards for the preservation of historic structures within the historic district. And then also provides provisions on demolition and demolition relief. You'll have seen in the proposed ordinance, it talks about if a building is deemed unsafe by our building official and needs to be demolished because of life safety concerns, it does require notification of the commission, but that can proceed. Also, applicants who have economic hardships and can demonstrate that they don't have the ability to maintain a property could seek approval of demolition from the Historic Preservation Commission. What this ordinance does not regulate, and I just wanted to reemphasize this, again, any work that doesn't require a building permit will not go through this process. Because again, that's the functional trigger of review by the city. Work that cannot be seen from the public street, any interior remodeling, and again, ordinary maintenance. I think one of the concerns that's been raised is if a baseball goes through somebody's window and busts the window, do they have to get Historic Preservation Commission review in order to replace that? No, that's ordinary maintenance of that window, and it wouldn't require a building permit anyway. So next steps. This afternoon, tonight, is your consideration of the proposed ordinance and your recommendation on to the City Council. In your packet, in the section of the staff report that highlights options for a Planning Commission recommendation, you can recommend approval of Resolution 1221, which includes the findings for the recommendation. You can recommend denial of Resolution 1221, or if you have certain elements of the ordinance that you support or proposed changes you want to make, you can make your recommendation in support conditioned on those changes. After the public comment period and Planning Commission deliberation and a recommendation by the Planning Commission, the next steps in the process for this ordinance are a bill introduction before the City Council. When that bill is introduced before the City Council, no action is taken by the City Council, no deliberation, they just introduce the bill. And then within 30 days, the City Council would then deliberate and then vote on the proposed ordinance changes. And so with that, I will take staff questions.
One thing that I don't see noted, but I think I heard reference to it earlier on, will the city provide either city or state funding, or will that be available to assist with costs that might be incurred by a homeowner trying to maintain their building in a historic, at an historic level?
So I think what's very important is the ability that the city now has with the contract with Northwind Resources to be able to have somebody with the expertise that can meet with property owners very early on in the process. One of the challenges with today's ordinance is that property owners hire a architect, hire a contractor, prepare plans, submit a building permit to the city. They've already have a vision in place without any guidance with respect to how to maintain a property's contributing status. And by the time it gets to the city and it gets to the Historic Preservation Committee, that is too far along in the process. And so with those resources now and the opportunity to consult with the Historic Preservation consultant very early on, that's one way the city can support property owners in their potential modifications to their home. Secondly, we have two grants that have been approved by the City Council specifically for historic preservation efforts. The first is a RDA grant for commercial properties where those commercial modifications can receive up to 50% reimbursement up to $100,000 for historic preservation efforts. Secondly, the City Council adopted a residential historic preservation grant, up to $10,000 reimbursed for those improvements. Again, exterior improvements that would help to preserve the historic property.
Thank you. So as far as you know, did the writers of this ordinance that we're looking at today, did they compare it to other communities? I believe it mentioned something about Las Vegas, but were there any other communities, San Diego, other recognized historic communities that this might have been patterned after?
When the ad hoc committee first convened at their first meeting, one of the things they asked for was examples from elsewhere. And so staff provided them examples of other ordinances, including the SHPO model ordinance. SHPO refers to the Nevada State Historic Preservation Office, and they had prepared an example ordinance that communities could consider.
All right. Thank you very much.